A man does not wake up one day and cheat. He slowly drifts, away from his presence, away from his principles, and eventually away from you. But the drift does not begin in the body. It begins in the silence of his attention and the stillness of his conscience. In our modern relationships, we tend to focus on what a person does, but wisdom teaches us to first ask what led him to do it, what allowed him to slowly walk away from his integrity, even before he walked away from your trust. If you want to understand when a man is capable of betrayal, don't just look at how he acts when he's happy. Look at how he responds to discomfort. Look at how he handles inattention, boredom, or emotional silence, because it is in these moments, these small spaces between stimulus and response, that a man's true respect for you is either cultivated or lost. And more importantly, your own ability to see clearly in these moments, to stay grounded in self-awareness and dignity, is the only way to protect not just your heart, but your peace. Let us begin this talk, not in fear, but in understanding. There is a Chinese proverb that says, "When the eye wanders, the heart soon follows." Though simple, it reveals a timeless truth about human nature, especially in the context of romantic relationships. In today's world, where distractions are endless and attention is divided across glowing screens and shallow connections, we must return to one principle. Wherever a man places his attention, he places his energy. And where his energy flows, his loyalty grows or disappears. When a man first enters into a relationship with a woman, his attention is naturally drawn toward her. This is not only psychological but physiological. In early stages of attraction, the brain is flooded with dopamine and oxytocin, the chemicals of desire and bonding. A man becomes energized by her presence, excited by her voice, and focused on learning her emotional landscape. His attention becomes a form of devotion. Every glance, every question, every act of kindness reflects an investment of energy. It is not simply that he wants her. It is that he sees her. And this seeing creates connection. But over time, the novelty fades. The chemistry settles. Life introduces challenges, responsibilities, distractions. If a man has not developed the discipline to continually bring his attention back to the woman he committed to, he begins to fragment his focus. First, he stops listening with presence. Then, he stops noticing the small things, the change in her tone, the shift in her spirit, the quiet longing in her words. His body may be present, but his mind has wandered. And once the mind drifts, intention weakens. When intention weakens, respect is no longer active. It becomes dormant, then absent. This drift is subtle. It rarely begins with malice. Sometimes it begins with something as ordinary as overworking. A man comes home tired, scrolls on his phone, forgets to ask how her day was. She notices. She says nothing. It happens again and again. Slowly a new habit is formed, disengagement. What used to be rich, emotional presence is replaced with routine silence. This is not cheating in the physical sense, but it is the opening of the door, the loss of sacred attention. One woman told me, "It's not that he cheated that broke me. It's that long before he did, I could feel he stopped choosing me." What she was sensing was the withdrawal of his attention, the loss of emotional commitment. From a psychological lens, this aligns with the concept of attunement. Attunement is the ability to be emotionally present and responsive. When a man no longer tunes in to the emotional frequency of his partner, she becomes unseen, unfelt, and eventually unloved. Now ask yourself this: what does a man who is losing respect look like? Not in his words, but in his focus. You will find the answer in how he listens, how he touches you, how he speaks your name when there is no need to impress. Is his attention clean and directed, or is it scattered, given to strangers on screens, buried in work, or lost in internal unrest? From a neuroscientific perspective, attention is a limited resource. The more often it is given to empty pleasures, visual stimulation, mindless consumption, digital fantasies, the less available it becomes for genuine emotional presence. The man who trains his mind to chase novelty cannot sit in stillness with a woman who needs consistency. And so, even before his body has wandered, his consciousness already has. Eastern philosophy reminds us, where the breath is, the mind follows. And where the mind goes, the spirit flows. If his breath never settles around you, his spirit cannot remain with you. A man who constantly lives in distraction is a man who is no longer aware of what is sacred. His inability to center himself in the present moment becomes the very reason he loses what is most valuable. Consider the story of Mei Lin, a healer from Taiwan who told me about her first marriage. "My husband loved me in the beginning," she said. "He wrote me poetry. He studied my face as if it was a prayer. But after our son was born, he became a stranger in the same room. He watched TV. He worked late. He didn't notice when I cried in the kitchen. One day, he told me he had been having an affair for 6 months. I wasn't even angry. I had already felt the betrayal. Long before his body left, his mind did." The story of Mei Lin is not rare. It happens across cultures, generations, and socioeconomic lines. Because betrayal is not always about desire, it is about distance. And distance is created not by miles, but by lack of mindfulness. The strongest predictor of infidelity is not dissatisfaction. It is disconnection. And disconnection begins the moment attention no longer feels sacred. So how do you respond? Not with fear, not with control, but with awareness. Pay attention to how attention is given. If a man consistently redirects his focus away from the relationship and does not return to emotional presence, despite your attempts to connect, understand that respect is slipping. Speak with calm clarity. Do not beg for attention. Observe its direction. If it consistently flows away, so will his loyalty. And here is the most difficult truth. No matter how much you love a man, you cannot fight his war of attention for him. You can invite presence, but you cannot force awareness. It is his discipline that determines whether he remains faithful, not just to you, but to the agreements of his own soul. Which leads us into a more invisible but potent truth. Emotional cheating does not begin in words or actions. It begins in attention. A man does not need to touch another woman to betray you. He only needs to fantasize about her. He only needs to escape to the comfort of someone else's admiration when he feels insecure. If he begins to seek emotional safety outside the bond you share, it is a form of betrayal no less damaging than physical infidelity. Emotional disconnection is often the precursor to cheating. This is the second key. A man who no longer shares his inner world is preparing to abandon the shared world you built. His silence is not neutral, it is strategic. It creates space where intimacy once lived. And if you are not attentive to this shift, you will find yourself in a relationship with a ghost, a man who says all the right things, but who no longer says anything meaningful. A man who smiles at dinner, but whose eyes have stopped asking you how you feel. From a psychological standpoint, this is known as emotional withdrawal. It is a defense mechanism used to avoid vulnerability, accountability, and sometimes guilt. When a man is emotionally disconnected, he may still go through the motions, buy gifts, show up to events, say, "I love you." But these gestures are hollow, because love is not sustained by performance. It is sustained by presence. Let us return to the energy of the relationship. When emotional connection fades, the energetic thread between two people weakens. In Eastern philosophy, we speak of qi, the life force that flows between beings. When two people are in harmony, their qi dances together. But when one person withholds emotionally, that energy becomes stagnant. It no longer flows, it fades. The woman begins to feel unseen, unloved, and uncertain. She begins to question her worth, not realizing that the disconnection is not a reflection of her value, but of his internal chaos. There is a common pattern here. When emotional disconnection takes root, a man may start seeking validation elsewhere. It may begin with small things, complimenting other women more than usual, texting ex-partners under the guise of checking in, watching content that feeds fantasy rather than connection. Each of these actions might appear harmless, but energetically, they represent a shift. He is no longer nourished by intimacy. He is now addicted to stimulation, and stimulation is the seed of infidelity. One woman shared her experience with emotional betrayal. "He stopped talking to me about his day. I'd ask how he was, and he'd say, 'I'm fine.' But I found out he was telling everything to a woman at his office. She knew more about his stress than I did. That broke me." This story illustrates a universal truth. Cheating does not begin with sex. It begins with secrets. Secrets are the cancer of intimacy. And when a man starts reserving parts of himself for someone outside the relationship, he is no longer respecting the sacred bond. He is investing emotional currency in someone else, and that currency cannot be spent twice. From a neuroscientific lens, this behavior activates the brain's reward system. New conversations, flirtation, and external validation produce dopamine. This creates a feedback loop that is chemically reinforcing. Meanwhile, the relationship suffers because it feels emotionally dull by comparison. Not because it lacks value, but because it requires depth, not novelty. Depth requires effort. Emotional connection requires courage. And not every man is willing to do that inner work. Some prefer the easy pleasure of attention from others over the hard work of authentic vulnerability. But here is where your power lies. You do not need to wait until he cheats to know that the connection is broken. You only need to observe whether he still chooses to meet you in your emotional world. Whether he still asks about your heart, not just your schedule. Whether he still invites you into his internal dialogue, not just his plans. A man who respects his woman does not hide behind silence. He speaks, not just about logistics, but about life. He lets her into his doubts, his questions, his joys. He makes her a part of his emotional story. Because he understands that connection is not sustained by physical presence alone. It is sustained by shared inner landscapes. So ask yourself this: is he still emotionally with you? Can you still feel his spirit when he speaks? Does he meet your eyes when you're sad? Or does he change the subject? Does he hold your fears with patience? Or does he dismiss them as dramatic? These are not just questions. They are signs, not of your insecurity, but of the state of your bond. And if you find that he has emotionally withdrawn, do not beg for connection. Invite clarity. Speak with calm courage. Say, I feel like there's distance between us, and I miss our emotional closeness. I want to understand what's happening inside of you. If you're willing to share, his response will tell you everything. If he shuts down, blames you, or avoids the conversation, you must see this not as a rejection, but as a reflection. He is not yet equipped to meet you in emotional depth, and you must decide if staying silent is a greater betrayal to yourself than walking away. Because the greatest act of self-respect is not staying in a relationship that feels safe. It is staying in one that feels sacred. And sacredness cannot exist where connection is absent. Let us continue this journey with open eyes, grounded awareness, and a deeper understanding of how emotional presence, or its absence, shapes the destiny of love. There is a silent danger that lingers beneath many relationships, a quiet shadow that grows not with shouts or betrayal, but with habits. Habits, seemingly small, carry enormous weight. They are the patterns we perform without thinking, yet they reveal everything about how we value or devalue the people in our lives. When a man begins to normalize neglect, he isn't just slipping into forgetfulness. He is training his nervous system to stop caring. And eventually, that internal shift becomes external distance. Respect dies not in a single moment, but in repeated, unconscious choices. Neglect is often misunderstood. Many think of it as active abandonment, as an absence that must be loud and painful. But more often, it is subtle. It wears the face of busy schedules, distracted minds, and emotional laziness. It looks like missed calls, unanswered messages, postponed dates. It sounds like, "We'll talk later," or "I'm tired," or "What's the big deal?" Spoken not once, but enough times that the other person stops expecting tenderness. From a physiological perspective, our bodies respond to these patterns. The human nervous system is designed to seek safety and connection. When we receive consistent care, our body releases oxytocin, the bonding hormone, and cortisol, the stress hormone, lowers. But when connection becomes unpredictable, the body enters a state of alertness. Over time, this emotional inconsistency becomes a form of emotional trauma. We learn to anticipate disappointment. And in many relationships, women learn to lower their expectations so as not to feel the ache of being forgotten. There's a woman named Celeste I once met during a retreat. Her voice trembled as she spoke, but her words were clear. He never hit me. He never cheated. But I felt like I was living with a stranger who only noticed me when I was gone. For 5 years, I asked for more quality time, more shared space. He said he was busy. Then, when he found time to talk to someone new, he said I was the one who grew distant. Her story is not unique. It is universal. Because when neglect becomes a habit, the woman becomes invisible long before she disappears. Psychology calls this pattern learned helplessness. When a person repeatedly experiences emotional disappointment, they stop expressing their needs. Why? Because they no longer believe those needs will be met. In relationships, This creates an emotional stalemate. The woman grows silent, not because she has no words, but because her words no longer move him. And the man, interpreting the silence as peace, assumes everything is fine. But beneath the surface, love has already begun to starve. In the teachings of Eastern philosophy, we are reminded that awareness must be continuous. In the Tao Te Ching, it is said, to see things in the seed, that is genius. When you look at a man's small daily choices, you can see the future of the relationship. A man who stops asking how your day was is not merely distracted. He is conditioning himself to no longer care. A man who repeatedly breaks promises, even small ones, is not merely forgetful. He is forming a habit of emotional unreliability. And a man who consistently chooses convenience over communication is silently announcing that your connection is not worth his effort. This is not always conscious. Often, a man does not wake up and decide to stop caring. Instead, he gradually lets go of intentionality. He becomes reactive rather than reflective. He allows stress, work, and ego to take up the space where presence once lived. He justifies his behavior with logic. I'm doing this for us. Or, this is how life is. But beneath these words is a truth too painful to admit. He is no longer showing up with reverence. When reverence dies, so does respect. And when respect fades, the doorway to infidelity opens, not always in physical form, but emotionally, spiritually, energetically. Because a man who has normalized neglect is already entertaining the idea that someone else might offer more ease, more validation, more pleasure. And the woman he once promised to honor becomes an afterthought in his pursuit of escape. Neglect is not passive. It is a spiritual message. I do not value your presence enough to protect it. And yet, many women endure this form of neglect, not because they lack strength, but because they are loyal to potential. They remember the man he used to be. The one who listened with interest, who brought tea without being asked, who remembered birthdays and celebrated small victories. They wait for his return, hoping love will bring him back. But here is the hard truth: hope is not a strategy. If a man's habits consistently show disregard, his intentions are irrelevant. As the Buddha taught, what we think, we become. What we do, we are. In other words, character is not defined by what we feel, it is defined by what we repeat. So how does a woman respond? Not with punishment, but with presence. First, she must return to her own awareness. Is she being emotionally fed in this relationship? Is her love being nurtured or merely tolerated? Is she holding space for a man who no longer holds space for her? These questions are not accusations. They are invitations. They help her see clearly, without the fog of fantasy. In the stillness of this self-inquiry, she begins to reclaim her power, not through anger, but through observation. She begins to track patterns. How often does he check in emotionally? How often does he remember what she loves? How often does he make time, not just give excuses? These details matter, because in them, you see whether he is a man of habit or a man of heart. And if she finds that neglect is his rhythm, then the next step is not confrontation, but conversation, a sacred one that says, I do not feel seen, I do not feel prioritized, and I cannot carry this connection alone. This is not a demand. It is a declaration of self-respect. And what happens next reveals everything. If he responds with humility, with a willingness to shift his habits, then there is space for healing. But if he minimizes her experience, deflects responsibility, or blames her for being too sensitive, then she must see clearly. She is not in partnership. She is in emotional exile. And emotional exile over time leads to betrayal. Because the man who stops showing up will eventually find a place where his absence is unnoticed. And that place will offer temptation, not because it is better, but because it feels easier. This brings us to a deeper dimension of betrayal, the silent undermining of trust through inconsistent behavior. Trust is not only broken by lies or affairs, it is broken by contradiction. When a man's words do not match his actions, he is not just confusing his partner, he is conditioning her nervous system to live in uncertainty. And uncertainty is poison to intimacy. Imagine a man who says, "You're the most important person in my life," but consistently prioritizes work, friends, or personal comfort over connection. Imagine a man who promises to change, but whose habits remain the same. The woman begins to feel two realities: what he says and what he does. And over time, she stops believing the words, not because she is bitter, but because her body can no longer find safety in his patterns. In psychology, this is called cognitive dissonance, the stress we feel when our reality does not match what we're being told. For many women, this stress becomes chronic. They love him, yet they doubt him. They believe in his heart, yet they fear his actions. They want to trust, but their intuition whispers warnings. And this inner conflict erodes their peace. A woman named Sarita once told me, he would swear he was loyal, but he hid his phone. He'd say he loved me, but flirt with other women on Instagram. He promised to spend more time with me, then canceled again and again. I felt like I was losing my mind. What Sarita experienced is the slow disintegration of trust, not through betrayal in one moment, but through the contradiction of many moments. Trust does not survive in confusion. It grows in clarity. From a neuroscience standpoint, the brain craves coherence. When a partner's behavior is inconsistent, the brain enters a state of threat detection. It constantly scans for danger, signs of lying, hiding, emotional withdrawal. This drains the nervous system and makes emotional safety impossible. And where safety is absent, connection dies. Shi Heng Yi often speaks of the alignment between words, actions, and intentions. He teaches that true integrity is not perfection, but consistency. When a man lives in alignment, his presence brings calm. But when he speaks love and performs avoidance, his presence brings confusion. And confusion is not a foundation for love. It is a breeding ground for betrayal. This inconsistency does not just affect the woman. It affects the man's own spirit. Every time he says what he does not mean, he fragments himself. Every time he promises what he will not keep, he weakens his own integrity. Over time, this fragmentation leads to internal shame. And shame, when not faced, becomes deflection. He begins to blame her for the emotional atmosphere he created. He calls her too emotional, difficult, never satisfied. But in truth, she is only reacting to the energy he has brought into the relationship. This blame is a defense, because to look inward would require accountability, and not every man is ready to hold the mirror that shows him his contradictions. So what can a woman do when trust is eroded by inconsistency? First, she must stop romanticizing potential. She must see the man not as who he was in the beginning, or who he promises to be in the future, but as who he is in his patterns today. She must listen not to his declarations, but to the rhythm of his habits, because love is not proven in moments, it is proven in motion. Then, she must decide, is she willing to live in confusion, or is she ready to choose clarity? This is not an easy choice, but it is a sacred one, because her peace is not a luxury, it is a necessity. Her emotional safety is not a gift to be earned, it is a standard to be honored. And if the man is willing to become consistent, to align his words with his actions, to rebuild trust through transparency and reliability, then healing is possible. But if not, then his inconsistency must be seen not as a flaw, but as a message that says, I am not yet ready to love in a way that protects what is sacred. And sacredness must be protected, not just with intention, but with action, not just with emotion, but with embodiment. Because in the end, love is not just what we feel, it is what we practice. And what we practice becomes who we are. There is a form of silence in relationships that is louder than words, more piercing than arguments, and more destructive than open conflict. It is the silence of emotional avoidance, the tendency of some men to suppress vulnerability, to sidestep intimacy, to retreat from emotional depth. While on the surface it may appear like self-control or strength, beneath it often lies fear, unresolved pain, and a lack of emotional literacy. And this avoidance, if left unchecked, can become the very force that drives a man to lose respect for his partner, and ultimately himself. In Eastern philosophy, we are taught that the body holds memory. Emotions that are not expressed do not disappear. They are stored within the cells, within the breath, within the nervous system. When a man continuously avoids emotions, his own and his partner's, he is not creating peace, he is creating pressure. And just like water seeks cracks in stone, suppressed emotion finds unexpected ways to escape. Sometimes it escapes as anger, as sarcasm, as passive aggression. But often, it escapes as disconnection, the slow and silent withdrawal of presence. Emotional avoidance is not always obvious. It doesn't announce itself. It hides behind the mask of logic, of business, of masculine stoicism. It often sounds like, I don't want to talk about it right now, or let's not make a big deal out of this. Or, you're overthinking things. Over time, this pattern conditions the woman to believe that her emotions are inconvenient, that her expressions of vulnerability are interruptions to be minimized, and in her attempt to maintain harmony, she may begin to silence herself. But here is the paradox: the more a woman silences herself to keep the peace, the more the relationship deteriorates. Because peace is not the absence of conflict. Peace is the presence of understanding, and understanding cannot exist where emotional avoidance is a habit. Consider the story of Lena and Marco. They were together for 6 years, and from the outside, everything looked stable. They didn't fight often. They had dinner together, shared responsibilities, and lived in a quiet rhythm. But inside Lena, a storm was brewing. Every time she tried to express her sadness, Marco would deflect. If she cried, he would become distant. If she brought up a difficult topic, he would distract himself with his phone or walk out of the room. Eventually, she stopped opening up. She stopped asking for emotional closeness. And slowly, the bond that once held them together dissolved. Not in a moment, but in many moments of silence. What many men do not understand is that when they avoid emotional discomfort, they are not protecting the relationship. They are starving it. From a neurological standpoint, this is deeply rooted in how men are often socialized. In childhood, boys are frequently taught to suppress their emotions. Don't cry. Be a man. Toughen up. These messages train the male brain to associate vulnerability with weakness. As a result, many men grow into adults who are emotionally illiterate, not because they lack emotions, but because they have never learned the language of them. The amygdala, the brain's center for processing emotion, does not simply shut down because a man chooses to suppress. It continues to signal stress when there is emotional conflict. But without healthy tools to process these signals, a man may instead develop avoidance as a coping strategy. He distances himself from emotional conversations, not because he doesn't care, but because he doesn't know how to navigate them without feeling overwhelmed. But what begins as a coping mechanism soon becomes a relational wound. Because the woman on the other side of that silence is not interpreting his avoidance as a sign of overwhelm. She is interpreting it as indifference. Shi Heng Yi often speaks of presence as the ultimate discipline. Presence is not just about physical availability, it is about emotional availability. It is the willingness to meet another person where they are, without flinching, without turning away. When a man chooses presence, he chooses to feel, even when it is uncomfortable. He chooses to listen, not just to words, but to the energy behind them. And most importantly, he chooses not to run from emotional intensity, but to breathe through it. In many cases, emotional avoidance is also tied to control. A man who fears emotions often fears unpredictability. He wants life, and especially relationships, to be neat, organized, and manageable. Emotions, especially a woman's emotions, can feel wild, untamed, and intense. So instead of leaning in, he tries to contain. Instead of engaging, he tries to correct. He says things like, "Why are you always so emotional?" Or, "Calm down," or, "You're making this a bigger deal than it is." But in doing so, he isn't calming the storm, he is ignoring it. And when a storm is ignored, it grows stronger. The woman, meanwhile, begins to feel unsafe, not physically, but emotionally. And emotional safety is the foundation of intimacy. Without it, there can be no true connection, no real surrender, no deep trust. She starts to question herself. Am I too much? Is it wrong to feel this deeply? Maybe I should just stop expressing how I feel. And this self-censorship slowly erodes her self-esteem. She becomes a version of herself that is muted, edited, and carefully controlled, just to avoid triggering his discomfort. This dynamic creates an emotional imbalance where one partner becomes the holder of all emotional labor. The woman becomes the feeler, the processor, the communicator. She carries the burden of keeping the relationship emotionally alive, while the man remains distant. And over time she becomes exhausted. Not from love, but from carrying it alone. Eventually, this exhaustion transforms into resentment. And resentment is not just a feeling. It is an energy that enters the relationship like a toxin. It changes the way she speaks, the way she touches, the way she looks at him. And if the man remains unaware, he may misinterpret her withdrawal as emotional coldness, never realizing that it was his avoidance that planted the seed. There is a quote often attributed to Carl Jung: "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." In relationships, this means that until a man becomes aware of his emotional avoidance, he will continue to sabotage connection and blame circumstances, or worse, his partner. But this can change, it must change, because emotional avoidance is not a permanent state, it is a habit. And like all habits, it can be transformed through intention and practice. The first step is acknowledgement. A man must be willing to admit that he has been avoiding emotional engagement. This requires courage, not the kind of courage that conquers mountains, but the kind that sits still in the face of discomfort. He must ask himself, what am I afraid of feeling? Where did I learn that emotions are dangerous? How have I hurt others by shutting down? These are not easy questions, but they are essential, because behind every pattern of avoidance is a wound, and that wound must be faced with honesty. Once acknowledged, the next step is emotional education. This may sound strange, but many men simply have not learned how to identify, name, and process their feelings. They know how to express anger, but not sorrow. They can speak about stress, but not shame. This gap in vocabulary creates a gap in intimacy. One method of emotional education comes from mindfulness practices. In the Shaolin tradition, we are taught to sit with emotions like we sit with breath, not to change them, but to observe them. When a man learns to sit with discomfort instead of fleeing from it, he becomes more emotionally resilient. He discovers that emotions, like waves, rise and fall. And the more he practices being present with them, the less power they have over him. Another method is relational practice. Learning to communicate feelings without defensiveness. This requires vulnerability. It means saying things like, "I feel overwhelmed and I don't know how to handle this," instead of, "You're too emotional." It means asking questions like, "What do you need from me right now?" instead of shutting down. These small shifts create profound changes. Because when a man begins to show up emotionally, the relationship transforms. The woman no longer has to beg for connection, she feels it. She no longer has to question his care, she experiences it. And the man, in turn, begins to experience a deeper form of respect, not only from his partner, but from himself. Because here is the final truth: emotional avoidance does not protect a man's power, it weakens it. It makes him less trustworthy, less present, less effective in love. But emotional presence, true presence, is power. It is the kind of power that cannot be shaken by a difficult conversation or a tearful moment. It is the kind of power that holds space without judgment, that listens without fixing, that loves without fear. And it is this kind of power that keeps respect alive, because respect is not only about boundaries and behavior, it is about presence. When a man shows up emotionally, consistently, with humility and courage, he is saying to his partner, "You matter, your emotions are valid, and I am not afraid to walk with you through them." This is the language of true masculinity, not silence, not suppression, but sacred strength. The strength to feel, the strength to stay, the strength to love fully, without fear of drowning in the depth of it. In this space, relationships are not just maintained, they are deepened, and men do not just keep love, they grow worthy of it. Not by avoiding emotion, but by mastering it. Not by closing off, but by opening up. Because it is only in the opening that real connection begins. In the quiet moments of human connection, when two people sit not in words but in presence, what often remains unseen is the invisible contract between energies. This contract is not written in paper, but in the language of frequency, integrity, and authenticity. In a relationship, the most sacred element that exists beneath all surface level behaviors, beneath all spoken promises and shared dreams, is this: how one person's energy consistently affects the other. When a man begins to leak his energy, scattering it to places and people that dilute his inner focus, something subtle yet deeply consequential begins to shift. This is not only about infidelity in a physical sense. Energy leakage is the precursor, the silent erosion of loyalty that often goes unnoticed until the effects become undeniable. The decline in attraction, the loss of sacredness, the breakdown of trust. These things do not begin with grand betrayals. They begin in the energetic world long before the physical act occurs. In traditional Eastern thought, particularly within Taoist philosophy and Shaolin wisdom, energy, or qi, is considered life force. It is the invisible substance that animates our being. Where your attention goes, your energy flows. And where your energy flows, life begins to manifest. In this sense, the direction of a man's attention is not neutral. It is a declaration of what he prioritizes, values, and worships. When that attention becomes fragmented, pulled toward validation from other women, fixated on superficial praise, or driven by unresolved desires, he begins to dilute his own inner power. This energy leakage becomes the silent destroyer of respect, because the woman may not know the exact details, but she feels it. Her body and intuition register the shift. Something is no longer contained. Something that was once devoted now feels distracted. And respect, like love, is sensitive to energy. It withers in the presence of inconsistency. It fades when sacred boundaries are crossed, not always physically, but energetically. Let us consider the story of Amir and Dana. Amir was a charismatic man, attentive, successful, and emotionally articulate. Dana loved his depth, his discipline, the way he made her feel cherished. But over time, she began to feel a slow drift. He still showed up, but something in his gaze had shifted. His compliments felt less connected. His moments of presence became interrupted by phone notifications, subtle flirtations, and the type of openness toward other women that once was reserved only for her. Dana never saw him cheat, but she felt him stray. When she confronted him, Amir denied anything inappropriate. "I've done nothing wrong," he said. "You're imagining things." And yet, he was no longer anchored. His energy was no longer centered in the relationship. Dana's nervous system, like that of every woman attuned to her intuition, responded not to the words but to the vibration behind them. And her body began to retreat, not out of punishment, but out of self-protection. In relationships, emotional safety is often established not by what is done, but by what is withheld. When a man chooses to contain his energy, to devote it fully, consciously, and respectfully to the relationship, he creates a fortress of trust. But when he becomes casual with his energy, he unknowingly breaks a sacred container. And when that container breaks, the feminine no longer feels safe to rest in her openness. She closes, she guards, and over time, she disengages. From a psychological perspective, this kind of energetic fragmentation is often rooted in unresolved insecurity. A man who feels unsure of his worth seeks validation not from his partner, but from external sources. Compliments from strangers, flirtatious interactions, excessive social media exposure. These become energetic band-aids for a deeper wound. But such validation is fleeting. Like drinking salt water, it may quench for a moment, but ultimately it deepens the thirst. This cycle pulls him further away from grounded intimacy and into a pattern of craving, one that can never be truly satisfied. This is why containment of energy is not about restriction. It is about sacred discipline. Master Shi Heng Yi often speaks of discipline not as punishment, but as protection. A disciplined man is not a man who denies himself joy, but a man who protects his joy from being contaminated by distraction. He does not avoid temptation because he is afraid. It is because he understands the cost of leaking his energy. He knows that once his attention fractures, so too will the quality of his presence, the strength of his word, and the clarity of his purpose. There is a passage in the Bhagavad Gita that says, "The mind is restless, turbulent, strong and unyielding. To subdue it is more difficult than controlling the wind." And yet, it is in this control, in the redirection of the wandering mind, that true power is cultivated. When a man learns to master his energy, he becomes a source of stability in his relationship. His partner does not need to question where he stands. She can feel the rootedness in him. She can trust that his love is not a performance, but a vow etched into the integrity of his choices. But this integrity must be built, not with grand gestures, but through small, repeated acts of loyalty. Loyalty begins in the imagination. When a man allows his fantasy life to be saturated with the images and approval of other women, he weakens the spiritual bond of his relationship. This is not about puritanical moralism. It is about energetic alignment. The thoughts we dwell on shape our emotional world. If a man consistently fantasizes about other women, he trains his brain to seek novelty rather than depth, and in doing so, he distances himself from the profound satisfaction that comes from knowing and being known by one woman in her entirety. From a neuroscience perspective, this pattern is reinforced through dopamine loops. The brain is wired to seek reward. Novelty stimulates dopamine. This is why the allure of flirting, attention, or explicit media can feel addictive. But like all addictions, the high is short-lived. And with each repetition, the threshold for satisfaction increases. What once felt exciting now feels ordinary. This leads to restlessness, emotional detachment, and a subtle yet persistent dissatisfaction with one's partner. But the antidote is not shame, it is awareness. A man who chooses to discipline his attention, to rewire his brain toward presence, appreciation, and depth, begins to experience fulfillment not as a fleeting emotion, but as a state of being. He trains himself to find joy in the familiar, beauty in the known, wonder in the consistent. And this training establishes the sacredness of the relationship. Consider the way a Shaolin monk trains with the same form for decades. At first glance, it seems repetitive. But within each repetition is an opportunity to refine, to deepen, to awaken new layers of presence. This is how a relationship becomes extraordinary, not through constant novelty, but through ever-deepening reverence. When a man treats his partner not as a possession, but as a temple of spirit and emotion, he no longer seeks elsewhere. His energy remains undivided. One story from the temple tells of a young disciple who asked the master, "How do I protect my strength from being taken by worldly distractions?" The master replied, "Be treating your energy as sacred currency. Would you scatter gold coins in the wind? Then why throw your attention to the passing glances of those who do not carry your soul?" In the same way, a relationship must be guarded, not out of fear, but out of devotion. The man must decide daily, where does my energy belong? What am I building with my presence? Am I cultivating safety or confusion? Am I scattering or anchoring? This daily decision becomes the foundation of respect, because respect is not just something a woman gives. It is something a man earns by the way he shows up consistently. When a woman sees that her partner does not entertain options, does not flirt with disrespect, does not create confusion with other women, she relaxes. She softens. Her body begins to trust. Her heart begins to bloom. And her admiration for him grows not because he demands it, but because he has made himself worthy of it. Energy containment also reflects in how a man speaks about his partner in public. Does he uplift her or diminish her? Does he protect her reputation when she is not present? Words are also carriers of energy. When a man speaks with reverence, his partner feels it. Even if she never hears the words, this reverence becomes a silent shield around the relationship. It says, "This union is sacred. I will not let the world stain it with gossip, disrespect, or casual disclosure." Equally important is the way a man handles emotional challenges within the relationship. When conflict arises, does he seek resolution within the bond, or does he outsource comfort to someone outside of it? Too many betrayals begin not with a decision to cheat, but with emotional outsourcing, seeking solace, understanding, or validation from a woman who is not the partner. These are energetic infidelities. They break the line of sacredness. They dilute the spiritual exclusivity of the relationship. To maintain energetic integrity, a man must have inner practices, moments where he reconnects with himself, realigns his values, and resets his direction. Meditation, breathwork, journaling, physical discipline, these are not luxuries. They are requirements for men who wish to lead their relationships with honor. Because only a centered man can remain unmoved by temptation. Only a grounded man can say, "I choose depth over distraction, devotion over desire, truth over ego." And for the man who walks this path, what awaits is not limitation, but liberation. He becomes free from the need to seek externally what already lies within. Free from the restlessness of craving, the fatigue of chasing, the emptiness of attention without meaning. His relationship becomes not a cage, but a container, a vessel for his highest expression of love, loyalty, and legacy. This is the kind of man a woman respects effortlessly, not because he demands it, but because his energy speaks for him. It tells her, "You are safe with me. I do not wander. I do not leak home." And in that home, she builds everything: her softness, her sensuality, her support, her surrender, not because she is weak, but because he has created the strength that allows her to open fully. This is the alchemy of sacred masculine and feminine energy. It is not performative. It is not public. It is deeply private, deeply real, deeply rare. But it is possible. And it begins with one question: where is my energy going? And who is paying the price for its absence? The man who answers this with courage, with humility, and with commitment is the man who will never have to fear losing respect, because he has become respect in motion, anchored, honorable, and aligned with something greater than himself. Let us now return to the still center from which this entire message was born. You see, when a man loses a woman's respect, it does not begin with loud arguments or dramatic exits. It begins in the quiet moments, moments when his energy wavers, when his discipline softens, when his emotional integrity becomes negotiable. The foundation of any sacred relationship is built not on how loudly love is proclaimed, but on how silently and consistently it is protected. A woman's respect is not granted indefinitely. It is nurtured, moment by moment, through the quality of a man's presence, the discipline of his choices, and the purity of his intention. And when a man allows himself to become distracted, scattered, or emotionally careless, he plants the first seed of betrayal. Long before he cheats with his body, he cheats with his mind, his imagination, and his energy. But understand this clearly: this path is not about control. It is about consciousness. It is not about perfection, but about presence. It is not about guilt, but about growth. The highest standard a man can hold himself to is not dictated by the expectations of the world. It is governed by the quiet agreement he makes with his own soul. And if he chooses alignment with that inner truth, he naturally becomes a man of character, consistency, and clarity. Such a man does not chase respect, he embodies it. He does not need constant affirmation, because he knows who he is when no one is watching. He guards his energy not to limit his experience, but to deepen it. He stays loyal not out of fear of losing his partner, but because he understands the value of what they are building together. His life becomes a vessel of sacred direction, a quiet, unwavering commitment to self-mastery. And what follows is inevitable. His woman opens, she softens, she trusts, because she is not responding to promises, she is responding to presence. In a world full of temptation, confusion, and noise, this kind of man becomes rare. But make no mistake, he is not born, he is forged, through discipline, through awareness, through the daily decision to remain rooted, intentional, and whole. So to every man listening, if you truly want to be loved, do not ask for love. Instead, become deeply worthy of respect. Contain your energy, honor your word, protect the sacred, and let your presence speak what your lips never need to say. This is the path of the strong. This is the path of the centered. This is the path of the man who will never have to fear losing love, because he has first mastered the ability to give it. Not through fleeting emotion, but through a powerful, grounded way of being. As master, I would say, where the mind goes, the energy flows. Where the energy is focused, the life begins to take shape. May you shape a life, and a love, that no longer fears betrayal, because it is built on the unshakable ground of respect.